As we begin to move into therapeutic intervention for speech sound disorders, it is important for us to consider the various philosophies and foundations for the intervention approaches that we use. There are 4 generally accepted orientations to learning. This could also be referred to as orientations to teaching, but these are the ways that we as therapists can build upon an individual's natural inclinations to teach them what they need to learn in order to better produce various phonemes. These orientations are the behavioral, cognitive, humanistic or experiential, and social. The behavioral approach to learning is most closely associated with B.F. Skinner. And Skinner was a behaviorist, and really at the heart of this approach to learning are the approaches we use in therapy when we state objectives and turn them into sequential steps. So it's very process oriented. We provide cues and prompts that guide our client to a certain behavior. And we use rewards or natural consequences to reinforce the desired behavior. And this is referred to as conditioning. Essentially what this means is that as we are in a therapy session and we are providing therapy to the individual, we are helping them to shape the way they produce certain phonemes. And this could be through those prompts and cues where we're showing them on ourselves, on them in a mirror. We're giving them feedback. Move your tongue here, put your lips like this. But we're also providing a reward at the end. So this is where those things like sticker charts or even a high five, good job, I like the way you said that phoneme. These are forms of reinforcement that prompt the client we're working with to continue with that specific behavior. Then we have the cognitive approach. This is most closely associated with Jean Piaget. And Piaget was a researcher who established his theory mostly from his own experience, observing people around him and his own family. And from there, went into researching how we develop. He's really focused on, he's more of a developmental theorist. But according to Piaget, there are 4 main stages or periods of development that we go through. These are the sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operations, and formal operations stages. Sensory motor really is more the infant, toddler stage. Pre-operational is preschool, maybe early elementary. And then we get into concrete operations, and then finally formal operations. His periods of development establish certain expectations for typical cognitive behavior. So we would expect that someone who is in the sensory motor stage, which is, as the name implies, it's about experiencing as well as the motor development, so fine motor and gross motor development, that the individual in that stage would be very motivated by experience. So in that particular stage, they're going to be exploring toys by putting them in their mouth. They're going to be pushing things off of tables, that type of an experience where they're learning through their senses. And then as they progress into the different stages, we would expect that as they're They mature cognitively, that our expectations for them should also mature, and that our expectations should be higher as they progress through these various stages. It gives us an opportunity to really look at our clients from a developmental perspective, and this is the foundation for setting parameters on standards for speech and language development. We know that different phonemes develop at different stages. So a 2-year-old is not expected to have the same phonemic inventory, to have as many speech sounds as someone who's 5 or 6 or 7. And so we look at our intervention from this perspective. I will be working on different phonemes with a 3-year-old than I might work on with a 5 or 6-year-old. And it's related to this idea of cognitive development and what the typical expectations are. We then have the humanistic or experiential approach. Now the names are synonymous. You can call it either humanistic or experiential. It's up to you. But this is most closely associated with Abraham Maslow. Now, Maslow had a theory that referred to as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And you may have heard of that in other classes. But in Maslow's opinion, we learn in certain environments. Certain environments are more conducive to learning than others, based on this idea of our hierarchy of needs. According to Maslow, we have a certain foundation need for security, for our physical needs to be met. If we are in an environment where we are not physically comfortable because of temperature, because of furniture, whatever reason it might be, perhaps we're sick. If our physical needs are not being met, then we're not in a position to learn in that particular environment. So in order for us to meet our clients' needs, we need to be sure that we have a physically and emotionally comfortable environment. And so we apply this in our therapy by making sure that our rooms are appropriate for learning. They're not overly distracting, yet they're not, we don't want them to be scary either. We want them to be an area where a student or client will feel comfortable approaching us in that environment. And then this approach also suggests that we should develop challenging and meaningful activities for clients to progress through therapy. And this is important, that concept of being meaningful. According to Maslow, if our therapy targets are not meaningful to our client, they won't be motivated to progress and to learn. So if you have a client, and you will without a doubt someday have a client who honestly doesn't see a problem with the way they speak, if they are comfortable with it, they're not worried about it, then their likelihood of them really being dedicated and invested in improving the way they speak is going to be slim. They're not going to really see the point. Whereas if you have a client that is very motivated and sees the importance of improving because they have some internal or external reason, they will be more likely to make progress in your therapy. Then we have the social approach. And this is most closely associated with Bandura. And according to Bandura, we learn by watching others. Um, and from that approach, we we have developed certain techniques for therapeutic intervention. One is description. So in description, we might be just simply describing what a client is doing. So if they're playing with a toy, um, we might just be sitting there and saying, "You're doing this," and "Oh, you have a car. Your car is going up the ramp. It's going down the ramp." And so we're just basically narrating. And I tell people that description is kind of like a play by play if you're watching a sports game. And we're not really talking to anyone, we're just sitting there describing what we see. And the child is then taking in auditorily the things that we're saying. So we may not be directly interacting, but they are internalizing this description that we're providing. We then have the idea of self-talk. In self-talk, we might be talking about what we're doing, describing what I'm doing. I'm doing this, I'm doing that. Again, providing a model and a way for us to demonstrate for the client. And then parallel talk is where we are maybe engaged in the same activity with them, but we're not necessarily directly interacting. Parallel means that we're playing the same thing at the same time, but not necessarily together. And then we have the concepts of expansions, where we build upon what is produced, and then extensions. And this is where we are extending what was produced and providing them more data. So extension is generalizing to more concepts and more situations. So this idea of social learning is the concept that supports our use of small group therapy. The idea is that having students in a small group, they will provide not only a model for one another. You may have students in a group where one can produce a phoneme better than another, and therefore they're serving as a positive model for that other student. But they also are in a situation where they are creating a sense of support for one another, and even to a certain degree, a little sense of maybe competition. We don't want great competition, but that can be a motivator. Is if they see someone else getting praise and someone else doing a good job saying something, then it may be a motivator for them to do the same. So this idea of social learning, where we learn from one another and one another's models, is important to our therapeutic intervention. So there are some generally accepted concepts when we talk about therapy, and they're listed here. One is that learning goes from concrete to abstract. So they go from very obvious, almost tangible, something you can touch, to more abstract, concept-based, that may not be something you could really physically see, but it's more in the mind, from simple concepts to complex. So that's how we learn. We remember new information best when there is a connection to prior knowledge, and I'm sure you've all experienced that. If you have some sort of a background and you can connect it to either prior learning or some experience you've had, then you're more likely to remember it, and it's more likely to make sense. This, I know I experienced that a lot as a student. After I had my own children, and I was taking developmental courses, it just made so much more sense to me, because I could think, oh, that's like when this child did this particular thing, and you can really relate to the information. Attention and focus are necessary for learning, and this is very important. We need to create an environment where, kind of that Maslow concept, where they are attending, they're focused, they're engaged. If they are distracted for either because they're hungry or there's some other factors involved, they're not going to make as much progress. Greater time on task, so the more time we spend in therapy, the more progress they're going to make. And more repetition results in greater progress. And then finally, incorporating 3 modalities of learning, a combination of visual, auditory, and hands-on, tactile, kinesthetic, the more likely they are to retain that information. If we just hear it or we just see it, we're not as likely to remember it. But if we see it, hear it, and touch it, then we are very likely to retain.